The day had an eerie quality to it from the moment I woke up. There was a heavy silence that hung in the air, the kind that presses down on you and makes you feel like you're being watched. It was Friday the 13th, and I tried to shake off the superstition that crept into my mind. It's just another day, I told myself. I live in a small town in the middle of nowhere, where everyone knows everyone and nothing much happens, or so I thought. The weather was gloomy, with dark clouds hanging low, threatening rain. I decided to take a walk to clear my head, hoping the fresh air would dispel the unease gnawing at my insides. As I walked through the deserted streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The usual bustle of the town was absent, and the few people I did see hurried along with their heads down, avoiding eye contact. It was as if the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. I wandered aimlessly until I found myself at the edge of the woods that bordered our town. These woods had a reputation. Stories of people going missing, strange noises, and eerie sightings were common, especially around Friday the 13th. Despite the growing knot of fear in my stomach, I felt a strange compulsion to enter. The path was overgrown, and the trees seemed to close in on me as I ventured deeper. The light grew dimmer, and the air colder. My footsteps sounded unnaturally loud, crunching leaves and snapping twigs. I thought I heard whispers, but every time I stopped to listen, there was only silence. I reached a small clearing, and that's when I saw it, a dilapidated cabin I had never seen before. It looked ancient, with moss-covered walls and windows that were nothing but empty, dark voids. I should have turned back, but something drew me closer. Curiosity? Stupidity? I couldn't tell. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before pushing it open. The interior was dark, musty, and filled with an oppressive sense of dread. I could barely see anything, but the outlines of old furniture and broken items were visible in the faint light. My heart raced as I stepped inside, each creak of the floorboards echoing like a gunshot. I was about to turn and leave when I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from deeper within the cabin. It was slow, deliberate, and sent chills down my spine. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound. I found myself in what must have once been a living room. The tapping was louder here, coming from a door that was slightly ajar. I took a deep breath and pushed it open, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. The tapping was now accompanied by a faint, high-pitched humming. I should have run, but my legs moved on their own. I descended the stairs, each step feeling like it might be my last. At the bottom, I found a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was a rocking chair, and in it sat a woman, her back to me. She was the source of the humming, and the tapping was her foot rhythmically hitting the floor. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. She stopped humming and the tapping ceased. Slowly, she turned her head to look at me, and I felt a scream rise in my throat but couldn't let it out. Her face was gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through me. "You shouldn't have come here," she said in a voice that was both soft and menacing. "They don't like visitors." "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. She ignored my question and stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. "You need to leave," she said, stepping closer, "before it's too late." I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to run, but my body felt frozen. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, and the air became heavy with an unnatural chill. The woman reached out a bony hand, her fingers brushing against my arm, and I felt a jolt of cold shoot through me. Suddenly, a deafening roar filled the room, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around us. The woman's eyes widened in terror, and she screamed, "Go! Now!" I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted up the stairs, the roar and the woman's screams echoing behind me. I burst out of the cabin and ran through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes and face. I didn't stop until I was back in the relative safety of the town. I told myself I was safe, but the feeling of being watched never left me. That night, as I lay in bed, the events replayed in my mind. Just as I began to drift off to sleep, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping coming from outside my window. I forced myself to look, and there, standing in the darkness, was the woman from the cabin, her hollow eyes staring up at me. The next morning, I packed my bags and left town. I never looked back, but the memory of that cabin and the woman's haunting gaze follows me. And every Friday the 13th, I hear that same tapping, reminding me that some places and some memories are inescapable. There's something about abandoned places that draws me in. The mystery, the history, the echoes of lives once lived within crumbling walls. It's irresistible. I guess you could call me an urban explorer, but that night, I was more of an idiot looking for trouble. It was Friday the 13th, and my friends dared me to spend the night in the old Miller Asylum on the outskirts of town. The asylum had been closed for decades, ever since a series of unexplained deaths and disappearances led to its abandonment. Naturally, the place had a reputation for being haunted, and ghost hunters occasionally trespassed there in hopes of capturing evidence of the paranormal. I didn't believe in ghosts, but the thought of exploring such a notorious site was too tempting to resist. Armed with a flashlight, my phone, and a backpack filled with snacks and a blanket, I made my way to the asylum just as the sun was setting. The building loomed against the darkening sky, its windows like empty eyes staring into my soul. The iron gates were rusted and ajar, a silent invitation to enter. The moment I stepped onto the overgrown path leading to the entrance, a cold breeze sent shivers down my spine. I shrugged it off as nerves and pushed forward. The front doors were surprisingly easy to open, creaking loudly as they revealed the dark interior. My flashlight beam sliced through the thick dust in the air, illuminating a grand foyer with a decaying staircase and peeling wallpaper. I decided to start with the main floor and work my way up. The place was a labyrinth of hallways and rooms, each more derelict than the last. Faded murals on the walls depicted scenes meant to calm the patients, but now they seemed twisted and grotesque in the dim light. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a leaky ceiling. As I wandered deeper into the asylum, I felt a growing sense of unease. It was as if the walls themselves were watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. I found an old records room and began rifling through the scattered papers, hoping to find something interesting. The files were filled with notes on the patients, detailing their illnesses and treatments. Electroshock therapy, isolation, experimental drugs, methods that now seemed barbaric and cruel. One name kept appearing in the files, Emily Blackwood. She had been admitted as a teenager for severe depression and hallucinations. Her records ended abruptly with a note that simply read, "Missing." The date was Friday, January 13th, 1967. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that tonight marked exactly 57 years since her disappearance. I decided to explore the upper floors, hoping to find Emily's room. The staircase groaned under my weight, and I was careful to avoid the rotting steps. The second floor was even more decrepit than the first, with large sections of the ceiling collapsed and debris littering the floor. My flashlight flickered, and I smacked it against my palm, cursing as the light stabilized. I found her room at the end of a long hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and my heart raced as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. The room was small, with a rusted bed frame and a broken chair. Faded photographs and childish drawings adorned the walls, remnants of a life cut short. As I looked around, I felt a sudden drop in temperature. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I heard a faint whispering, too soft to make out the words. I turned, and my flashlight illuminated a figure standing in the corner. It was a girl, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. She looked directly at me, and I felt a jolt of terror as I realized it was Emily. Before I could react, she vanished, leaving only an icy cold spot where she had stood. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could finally understand them. "Help me. Find me." I stumbled back into the hallway, my mind racing. What had I just seen? Was it a hallucination brought on by the eerie atmosphere? Or was Emily's spirit truly trapped here, begging for release? Determined to find answers, I made my way to the basement, where the most disturbed patients were said to have been kept. The stairs leading down were treacherous, and I nearly fell several times. The air grew colder and damper the deeper I descended, and the smell of mold and decay was overwhelming. The basement was a maze of cells and treatment rooms, each one a testament to the horrors that had taken place here. I found a room that looked like it had been used for storage, filled with old equipment and broken furniture. As I searched through the clutter, I noticed a loose panel on the wall. Behind the panel was a small, hidden compartment. Inside, I found a bundle of old newspapers and a leather-bound journal. The journal belonged to Dr. Harold Miller, the asylum's head physician. His final entries were frantic and incoherent, detailing his attempts to cure Emily with increasingly brutal methods. The last entry was dated the night she disappeared, and it ended with a single chilling sentence: "She is gone, but she will never leave." Suddenly, the door to the storage room slammed shut, and the temperature plummeted. I heard Emily's voice again, clearer this time. "Help me. Find me." The walls began to close in, and I felt a crushing weight on my chest. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. In a blind panic, I clawed at the door, my fingers bloody and raw by the time it finally gave way. I stumbled out of the asylum, gasping for air, and didn't stop running until I was back in town. My friends were waiting for me, their laughter dying on their lips when they saw my pale face and trembling hands. I told them everything, and they listened in stunned silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Emily's voice, begging for help. I knew I had to do something, but I was terrified. The next morning, I returned to the asylum with a priest, hoping to perform some kind of ritual to release her spirit. We found her hidden remains in the basement, and the priest said a prayer over them. As we left, I felt a sense of peace wash over me, and I knew that Emily was finally at rest. But the experience changed me. I no longer seek out abandoned places, no longer tempt fate, because some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some spirits are better left undisturbed. There are few things more isolating than working the graveyard shift at a gas station in the middle of nowhere. My name is Sam, and I've been doing this job for the past year, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened last Friday the 13th. The night started off like any other. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant chirping of crickets. The few customers I had were truckers looking for coffee and snacks to keep them awake on the road. By midnight, the place was dead, and I was left alone with my thoughts. The clock ticked slowly, and I busied myself by stocking shelves and cleaning up the already spotless counter. Around 1 a.m., a thick fog rolled in, blanketing everything outside. The world seemed to disappear, and the gas station became an isolated island of light in a sea of darkness. I was wiping down the coffee machine when I heard the bell above the door jingle. I looked up, expecting to see a tired traveler, but the store was empty. Unease prickled at the back of my neck, but I shrugged it off and went back to work. Then I heard it again, the bell. This time, I was certain someone had entered. I walked around the counter, peering down the aisles, but there was no one there. The fog pressed against the windows, making it impossible to see more than a few feet outside. Feeling a growing sense of dread, I returned to my spot behind the counter. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the building settling. I kept glancing at the door, expecting it to open, but it stayed firmly shut. At around 2 a.m., the power went out. The sudden darkness was disorienting, and I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands trembling. I managed to find it and clicked it on, the beam of light cutting through the pitch-black interior of the store. I tried the phone, but the line was dead. Typical. I decided to check the circuit breaker in the back room. The narrow hallway leading to it was even more claustrophobic in the darkness, and the beam of my flashlight seemed woefully inadequate. I reached the breaker box and flipped the switches, but nothing happened. The power was out for good. As I turned to head back to the front, I heard something that made my blood run cold, a low, guttural growl coming from the store. I froze, listening intently. The growl came again, closer this time. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly made my way back, shining the flashlight ahead of me. The beam illuminated the aisles, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded small and scared. There was no response, just that unnerving growl. I reached the counter and scanned the area, but there was nothing unusual. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination when I heard the growl again, louder and more menacing. It was coming from the storage room behind the counter. Summoning all my courage, I approached the door and slowly opened it. The smell hit me first, an overwhelming stench of decay and rot. I gagged, shining the flashlight inside. The storage room was small and cluttered with boxes, but there was no obvious source of the smell. Then I saw it. A large, dark shape crouched in the corner, its eyes reflecting the light from my flashlight. It was a dog, but unlike any dog I'd ever seen. Its fur was matted and patchy, its eyes glowing with an unnatural yellow light. The growl rumbled from its throat as it bared its teeth at me. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. How had it gotten in? And what was wrong with it? I kept the flashlight trained on the creature as I edged toward the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the light steady. As I reached for the doorknob, the dog lunged. I slammed the door shut just in time, hearing its body crash against the wood. My heart raced as I pushed a shelf against the door to barricade it. The growling turned to frantic scratching and thumping, the door rattling on its hinges. I ran to the front of the store, desperate to find some way to protect myself. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from one of the shelves, gripping it tightly as I listened to the chaotic sounds from the back. The fog outside seemed thicker than ever, pressing against the windows like a living thing. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. I strained to hear any sound, but there was nothing. My mind raced with possibilities. Had it escaped somehow? Was it waiting for me to let my guard down? Minutes felt like hours as I stood there, every muscle tense, waiting for the next move. The fog outside began to thin, and I could see the faint glow of approaching dawn. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The bell above the door jingled again. I spun around, flashlight raised, but the store was empty. I felt a cold breath on my neck and turned slowly. There, in the reflection of the glass door, I saw it. The dog standing right behind me, its eyes glowing brighter than before. It didn't make a sound, just stared at me with a malevolent intelligence. I swung the flashlight, but it passed through empty air. The dog vanished, leaving only the chilling echo of its growl. I ran outside, desperate to escape, and didn't stop until I reached the nearest house, pounding on the door until someone answered. I never went back to that gas station. I quit my job and moved to the city, where the lights are always on and there's always someone around. But even now, every Friday the 13th, I hear that growl in my dreams, and I see those glowing eyes watching me from the darkness.